The silence in the marble hallway was deafening as Marcus Ashford dismissed yet another specialist with a wave of his manicured hand. 3 years. 3 years since the accident had stolen his wife's consciousness, leaving her body breathing but her spirit seemingly gone forever. What began as hope had slowly transformed into bitter resignation, and now into something darker, a cold detachment that had infected every corner of his sprawling estate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Patricia Wells, the latest neurologist in a parade of medical experts, gathered her files with practiced professionalism. Mr. Ashford, I understand your frustration, but sometimes the kindest thing is to give up. Marcus's voice cut through the air like a blade. Thank you for your time, doctor. My assistant will see you out. The clicking of expensive heels on imported marble echoed as the doctor departed, leaving Marcus alone in the corridor outside his wife's private medical suite. Through the reinforced glass window, he could see Isabella's motionless form surrounded by the quiet hum of life support equipment. Once, she had been the vibrant center of his world, a renowned opera singer whose voice could move audiences to tears. Now she lay silent, her breathing regulated by machines, her eyes closed to a world that no longer held her interest. Marcus Ashford had built his fortune in pharmaceutical investments, transforming a modest inheritance into a multi-billion-dollar empire. His company, Ashford Biomedical, held patents on 17 life-saving medications and funded research facilities across 4 continents. Success had been his constant companion until that rainy evening 3 years ago when a drunk driver had changed everything in an instant. The accident had left Isabella in what doctors clinically termed a, quote, persistent vegetative state. Her body had healed from the physical trauma, but her consciousness remained trapped somewhere beyond the reach of modern medicine. Marcus had spared no expense in his quest to bring her back. Private specialists from Switzerland, experimental treatments from Japan, cutting-edge technology from Germany. Each attempt had ended in disappointment, each failure driving him deeper into an isolation that matched his wife's condition. The estate reflected his transformation. What had once been a warm home filled with Isabella's laughter and impromptu concerts had become a sterile fortress. The grand piano in the music room sat untouched, its ebony surface collecting dust like a monument to lost joy. The staff moved through the corridors like ghosts, speaking in whispers and avoiding their employers' increasingly volatile moods. Carmen Rodriguez had witnessed this gradual descent into darkness during her 18 months of employment at the Ashford estate. She had been hired as part of the household cleaning staff, one of 12 employees who maintained the 40-room mansion and its meticulously landscaped grounds. Her duties were straightforward: dust the endless parade of expensive artifacts, vacuum Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes, and maintain the pristine appearance that Marcus demanded in every corner of his domain. What Marcus didn't know, what none of her colleagues suspected, was that Carmen possessed a secret that could have changed everything. Hidden beneath her modest uniform and quiet demeanor lay a past that seemed impossible, given her current circumstances. Before immigration had brought her to this country, before economic necessity had forced her into domestic work, Carmen had been Sister Carmen Elena Rodriguez, a Benedictine nun who had spent 15 years in the monastery of Santa Clara in Spain. Her life in the convent had been devoted to the preservation of sacred music, specifically Gregorian chant and medieval Latin liturgy. She had been one of only 30 women in the world, certified as a master of sacred vocal arts, trained in the ancient techniques that had been passed down through centuries of religious tradition. Her voice had once echoed through Gothic cathedrals, leading evening prayers and dawn masses for a community of believers who understood the healing power of sacred song. The decision to leave the religious life had not come easily. When her mother fell gravely ill back home in Honduras, Carmen faced an impossible choice. The monastery's vow of poverty meant she had no resources to provide the medical care her family desperately needed. After months of prayer and consultation with her mother superior, she had made the painful decision to request release from her vows. The church had granted her request with understanding and blessing, but the transition to secular life had been more challenging than she had anticipated. Immigration had brought her to the United States with little more than basic English skills and a determination to support her family. Her religious credentials meant nothing to potential employers who needed practical skills rather than spiritual expertise. The only work available had been domestic service, a humbling reality that she had accepted with the same grace that had carried her through years of monastic discipline. Carmen had been cleaning the medical suite when she first heard the doctors discussing Isabella's condition with Marcus. She had learned to become invisible during such conversations, understanding that her presence was tolerated only as long as she remained unnoticed. But the medical terminology had been familiar to her from her time caring for elderly nuns at the monastery, and she had found herself listening with growing interest to their assessments of Isabella's neurological state. The doctors spoke of brainwaves and cortical activity, of stimulation therapy, and pharmaceutical interventions. But Carmen heard something else in their clinical descriptions. A woman trapped not just by medical trauma, but by the profound silence that had replaced the music that had once defined her existence. Isabella Ashford had been an opera singer, a woman whose very identity had been woven from melody and harmony. Now she lay surrounded by the harsh beeping of monitors and the mechanical whisper of ventilators, as far from music as it was possible to be. The idea had begun as a whisper in Carmen's mind during one particularly difficult evening. Marcus had spent the day in consultation with a team of specialists from Johns Hopkins, emerging from the meetings with an expression of barely contained fury. She had been dusting the adjoining sitting room when she heard him speaking to his business partner on the phone, his voice heavy with a despair that made her heart ache. 3 years, Robert. 3 years, and we're no closer to reaching her than we were the day after the accident. Maybe it's time to accept that she's not coming back. The words had struck Carmen like a physical blow. In her years at the monastery, she had witnessed what the sisters called miraculous recoveries among their elderly community members. Women who had been pronounced beyond medical help had sometimes found their way back to consciousness through what could only be described as divine intervention. But Carmen had also observed that these moments of grace often occurred not in the presence of medical technology, but in the quiet spaces filled with prayer and sacred music. The Gregorian chant that had been her specialty was more than just religious music. It was an ancient form of healing that recognized the connection between sound, spirit, and the deepest levels of human consciousness. The specific frequencies and modal structures of Latin liturgical music had been designed over centuries to create states of profound meditation and spiritual openness. If Isabella's consciousness was trapped somewhere beyond the reach of conventional medicine, perhaps it could be called back through the same musical pathways that had once defined her existence. Carmen had begun experimenting with this theory during her evening shifts when the house grew quiet and Marcus retired to his study. She would enter Isabella's room under the pretense of cleaning, but instead would spend a few precious minutes singing softly near the patient's bedside. She started with simple Gregorian chants, the same Ave Maria that had been sung in monasteries for over 1,000 years, the Veni Creator Spiritus that called upon divine inspiration, the Te Deum that had comforted countless souls in their darkest hours. The medical equipment showed no immediate response, but Carmen had not expected instant results. Sacred music worked on deeper levels than those measured by conventional instruments. She had seen its effects countless times at the monastery. The way ancient melodies could calm agitated patients, reduce pain, and sometimes even facilitate healing that defied medical explanation. If Isabella's spirit was lost somewhere in the darkness of her condition, perhaps the pure vibrations of Latin chant could serve as a beacon to guide her home. Marcus remained unaware of these nocturnal concerts, absorbed as he was in his increasingly desperate search for medical solutions. His days were consumed with conference calls to research facilities, consultations with experimental treatment centers, and the grim task of managing a pharmaceutical empire while his personal world crumbled around him. He had grown increasingly irritable with the household staff, his grief manifesting as impatience with anything that reminded him of the normal life he had lost. Carmen observed his suffering with the compassion that her religious training had instilled in her. She understood that his anger was not truly directed at the staff, but at a universe that had allowed such a senseless tragedy to destroy his happiness. His wealth and influence, which had solved every other problem in his life, proved utterly powerless against the mysterious workings of the human brain. This helplessness had transformed a previously generous employer into a man who found fault with every aspect of his domestic arrangements. The other staff members had grown to dread their interactions with Marcus, hurrying through their duties to avoid his critical attention. But Carmen found herself moved by his obvious pain, recognizing in his desperate efforts to save his wife the same devotion she had once witnessed among families at the monastery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Love, she had learned, could manifest as fierce determination as easily as gentle tenderness, and Marcus's relentless pursuit of a cure was simply another expression of his unwavering commitment to Isabella. It was during her 4th week of secret serenades that Carmen noticed the first subtle change in Isabella's condition. She had been singing the Magnificat, her voice weaving through the ancient Latin text with the precision that years of monastic training had perfected. The melody was particularly beautiful, rising and falling in the modal patterns that had been designed to lift the human spirit toward divine contemplation. As her voice reached the phrase, Et exultavit spiritus meus, Isabella's breathing seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of the chant. The change was so subtle that the monitoring equipment registered nothing unusual, but Carmen's trained eye caught the slight shift in Isabella's respiratory pattern. After 15 years of leading communal prayers, she had developed an acute sensitivity to the way breathing responded to sacred music. The human body, she knew, was designed to resonate with certain frequencies, and Isabella's unconscious mind appeared to be responding to the ancient vibrations in ways that modern medicine couldn't detect. Encouraged by this small sign, Carmen began to expand her repertoire. She researched Isabella's operatic career, discovering that the soprano had been particularly renowned for her performances of sacred works by Mozart, Verdi, and Bach. Perhaps, Carmen reasoned, incorporating melodies that Isabella would have known and loved might create an even stronger connection to her lost consciousness. She began weaving familiar operatic themes into her Gregorian chants, creating a unique blend of sacred and secular music that honored both Isabella's religious heritage and her artistic identity. The Ave Verum Corpus by Mozart became a bridge between worlds, its soaring melody supported by the ancient modal structures of medieval chant. Bach's Erbarme dich found new expression when filtered through the contemplative rhythms of monastic tradition. These innovations required Carmen to draw upon the full depth of her musical training. Creating seamless transitions between Gregorian chant and classical repertoire demanded not only technical skill, but also an intuitive understanding of how different musical traditions could complement each other. She was, in effect, composing an entirely new form of therapeutic music, one that combined the healing properties of ancient sacred song with the emotional power of the operatic tradition that had defined Isabella's professional life. The sessions grew longer as Carmen's confidence increased. What had begun as 5-minute interludes expanded into 20-minute concerts, timed carefully to avoid detection by the night security staff. She learned the rhythms of the household's evening routine, identifying the windows of opportunity when she could be alone with Isabella without arousing suspicion. The medical suite's soundproofing, originally installed to protect Isabella's rest, now served to conceal these clandestine performances from the rest of the house. Marcus's study was located 2 floors below the medical suite, separated by enough distance and insulation that Carmen's singing remained undetected. He typically spent his evenings reviewing financial reports or participating in conference calls with international partners, his attention focused on maintaining the business empire that funded his wife's care. The irony was not lost on Carmen that his dedication to earning money for Isabella's treatment kept him away from her bedside during the very hours when her consciousness might have been stirring in response to the music that surrounded her. As weeks passed, Carmen began to notice additional signs that Isabella's awareness might be returning. Her facial expressions, while still peaceful, seemed to show more variation throughout the day. The nursing staff mentioned that her sleep patterns had become more regular, alternating between deeper rest and periods of lighter unconsciousness. Most significantly, Isabella's vital signs showed subtle improvements. Her heart rate had stabilized, her blood pressure had normalized, and her overall physical condition appeared to be strengthening despite the unchanged neurological assessment. Carmen documented these observations in a private journal, writing in Spanish to ensure privacy. She recorded not only Isabella's responses to specific pieces of music, but also her own growing understanding of how sacred sound could affect human consciousness. This was, she realized, original research in a field that barely existed, the intersection of ancient liturgical music and modern neuroscience. Her work was creating a bridge between 2 worlds that rarely acknowledged each other's existence. The challenge of maintaining her secret grew more complex as Isabella's condition began to attract renewed medical attention. Marcus, desperate for any sign of improvement, had arranged for round-the-clock monitoring by a team of neurological specialists. The installation of additional equipment meant that Carmen had to be even more careful about the timing of her visits, ensuring that her presence wouldn't be detected by the increased security measures. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the lead neurologist, had begun visiting the estate twice weekly to review Isabella's progress. He was puzzled by the subtle improvements in her condition, noting in his reports that her overall health seemed to be stabilizing in ways that couldn't be explained by the standard protocols they were following. The mystery deepened when brain scans showed slight increases in activity in regions associated with auditory processing, despite the fact that Isabella showed no conscious response to verbal communication. Carmen overheard these discussions with growing excitement, tempered by caution. The medical team's observations confirmed what she had been witnessing during her secret concerts, but she knew that revealing her role in Isabella's improvement would likely result in immediate termination. Marcus had grown increasingly protective of his wife's medical care, tolerating no deviation from the prescribed treatments. The idea that a domestic worker had been conducting unauthorized musical therapy would undoubtedly be seen as an unacceptable breach of protocol. Yet Carmen also understood that her informal experiments were approaching a critical juncture. Isabella's responses to the music were becoming more pronounced, suggesting that a breakthrough might be imminent. If she could document a significant improvement, perhaps even a moment of conscious awareness, the potential benefits to Isabella's recovery would outweigh any personal consequences she might face. The opportunity presented itself on a quiet Thursday evening in late October. Marcus had traveled to Boston for a medical conference, leaving the estate under the supervision of his head of security. The skeleton crew of evening staff had completed their duties early, and Carmen found herself with nearly an hour of uninterrupted access to Isabella's suite. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, selecting a program of music that combined the most powerful elements of her Gregorian training with melodies she knew Isabella would recognize from her operatic career. Carmen began with the Veni Creator Spiritus, her voice filling the medical suite with the ancient invocation for divine inspiration. The Latin words flowed with the precision of countless repetitions, each syllable placed with the care that 15 years of monastic discipline had instilled. As the chant concluded, she transitioned seamlessly into Mozart's Laudate Dominum, allowing Isabella's soprano repertoire to blend with the sacred tradition in a musical conversation that spanned centuries. The monitoring equipment registered subtle changes, almost immediately. Isabella's heart rate, which had remained stable throughout Carmen's previous sessions, began to show slight variations that seemed to correspond with the musical phrases. Her breathing, while still supported by the ventilator, developed a rhythm that matched the ebb and flow of the melodies. Most remarkably, the EEG readings showed patterns of brain activity that the medical team had not observed since the early weeks following the accident. Carmen continued with growing confidence, her voice building toward the climactic moment she had been planning for weeks. She had chosen the Pai Jesu from Fauré's Requiem, a piece that Isabella had performed countless times, and that combined the Latin liturgical tradition with the emotional power of romantic composition. As her voice rose to the piece's soaring high notes, something extraordinary happened. Isabella's eyes opened. The moment lasted only seconds, but Carmen was certain of what she had witnessed. For the first time in 3 years, Isabella Ashford had looked directly at her, her gaze focused and aware. The expression in those eyes was unmistakable: recognition, gratitude, and a deep understanding that transcended the medical explanations that had failed to reach her consciousness. The EEG machine erupted in a cacophony of alerts as Isabella's brain activity spiked beyond anything the equipment had recorded since her admission. Carmen watched in amazement as the woman who had been declared unreachable for 3 years began to show unmistakable signs of returning awareness. Isabella's fingers, which had remained motionless for so long, began to move in small gestures that seemed to follow the rhythm of the music that still echoed in the room. Carmen's first instinct was to call for the medical team, but she hesitated as she realized the implications of what had just occurred. Her unauthorized musical therapy had achieved what millions of dollars in medical treatment had failed to accomplish. Isabella was returning to consciousness, drawn back by the same sacred sounds that had once provided Carmen with purpose and meaning in her own life. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside signaled the end of Carmen's private moment with Isabella. The evening security guard was making his rounds, and she would need to resume her role as an invisible domestic worker. But as she quietly gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave the medical suite, Carmen caught Isabella's eye one final time. The soprano's gaze followed her movement, and her lips seemed to form the beginning of a word, a sign that the breakthrough was real and that the healing power of sacred music had bridged the gap between consciousness and the void. As Carmen slipped out of the medical suite and returned to her modest quarters in the staff wing, she knew that everything was about to change. The secret she had guarded for months was about to be revealed, and with it, the truth about her own hidden identity would inevitably come to light. But for the first time since leaving the monastery, she felt the same sense of divine purpose that had guided her religious vocation. She had been placed in this household not by accident, but by the same mysterious providence that had led her to dedicate her life to the healing power of sacred song. The next morning would bring Dr. Hayes's weekly visit, and with it, the discovery that Isabella's condition had changed dramatically overnight. Questions would be asked, investigations would be launched, and Carmen's role in the miraculous improvement would eventually be uncovered. But tonight, as she knelt in prayer beside her narrow bed, Carmen felt only gratitude for the privilege of witnessing the moment when ancient music had called a lost soul back to the world of the living. The transformation of Isabella Ashford had begun, and with it, the revelation of truths that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about healing, faith, and the woman who had been quietly working miracles in his own home. Dr. Samuel Hayes arrived at the Ashford estate precisely at 9 in the morning, carrying his leather briefcase and the weary expression of a man who had delivered too much disappointing news to grieving families. His weekly consultations with Marcus had become routine exercises in managing expectations, gentle reminders that miraculous recoveries existed primarily in medical textbooks rather than real-world neurological practice. Today, however, would shatter every assumption he had formed about Isabella Ashford's prognosis. The security guard who escorted him to the medical suite seemed unusually animated, mentioning something about unusual activity during the night shift that Dr. Hayes dismissed as the overactive imagination of untrained personnel. 3 years of monitoring Isabella's condition had produced no significant changes, and he approached the morning's examination with the same clinical detachment that protected him from the emotional toll of treating hopeless cases. The first indication that something extraordinary had occurred came from the overnight monitoring reports. The computer system had recorded a spike in neurological activity at approximately 10:15 the previous evening, followed by sustained periods of brainwave patterns that resembled natural sleep cycles rather than the persistent vegetative state that had defined Isabella's condition. Dr. Hayes stared at the printouts with growing incredulity, checking and rechecking the timestamps to ensure the equipment hadn't malfunctioned. Isabella herself appeared unchanged at first glance, lying peacefully in the adjustable hospital bed that had been her world for 3 years. But as Dr. Hayes began his standard neurological assessment, he noticed subtle differences that made his pulse quicken with professional excitement. Her muscle tone had improved overnight, showing less of the flaccid quality that typically characterized long-term comatose patients. Her breathing patterns, while still assisted by the ventilator, showed more natural variation than he had observed in previous examinations. The breakthrough came when Dr. Hayes tested Isabella's pupillary response with his penlight. Instead of the sluggish, minimal reaction he had documented for months, Isabella's pupils contracted sharply and tracked the movement of the light across her visual field. More remarkably, her eyes remained open after the test, focusing on his face with an alertness that sent an electric shock through his professional composure. Marcus received the phone call while reviewing quarterly reports in his Boston hotel room. Dr. Hayes's voice carried an urgency that immediately commanded his attention, explaining that Isabella was showing signs of emerging consciousness and that his immediate return was essential. The private jet that had carried him to the medical conference reversed course within the hour, racing across the northeastern sky while Marcus wrestled with emotions he had thought permanently buried beneath layers of protective resignation. The scene that greeted him at the estate defied 3 years of medical pronouncements about his wife's irreversible condition. Isabella was awake, her eyes tracking movement around the room with obvious intelligence despite her inability to speak around the ventilator apparatus. Dr. Hayes had summoned a team of specialists who were conducting a battery of tests to assess the extent of her cognitive recovery, their excited conversations filling the medical suite with an energy that had been absent since the accident. Isabella's recognition of Marcus was immediate and profound. Tears formed in her eyes as he approached her bedside, and her hand moved slightly in what appeared to be an attempt to reach toward him. The emotional reunion was complicated by the medical equipment that still sustained her basic functions, but the fundamental miracle was undeniable. After 3 years of absence, Isabella Ashford had returned to consciousness. The medical team worked through the afternoon to evaluate Isabella's neurological status and begin the delicate process of weaning her from the life support systems that were no longer necessary. Her cognitive functions appeared largely intact, though communication remained limited by the breathing apparatus and the weakness that 3 years of immobility had imposed on her vocal cords. Physical therapy would be required to restore her motor functions, and speech therapy would help her regain the voice that had once graced opera houses around the world. Dr. Hayes found himself struggling to explain the sudden transformation to Marcus and the assembled medical team. Spontaneous recovery from persistent vegetative states occurred in medical literature with roughly the same frequency as lottery victories, and Isabella's case showed none of the gradual improvement that typically preceded such awakenings. Her emergence had been abrupt and complete, as though some external stimulus had suddenly reconnected her consciousness to her physical body. The investigation into the cause of Isabella's recovery began immediately. Dr. Hayes ordered comprehensive reviews of all medications, environmental changes, and potential stimuli that might have triggered the awakening. The overnight security footage was examined for any unusual activity. Interviews were conducted with the medical staff, and every variable in Isabella's care was scrutinized for clues that might explain the inexplicable transformation. Carmen continued her regular duties throughout the day, cleaning and maintaining the household areas while the medical drama unfolded in the suite above. She moved through her tasks with practiced efficiency, but her mind remained focused on the implications of what she had witnessed. Isabella's awakening vindicated years of conviction about the healing power of sacred music, but it also placed Carmen in an impossible position regarding her own role in the miracle. The decision to reveal her involvement came when she overheard Drive Hayes expressing frustration about the mystery surrounding Isabella's recovery. He was speaking to Marcus in the study, their conversation carrying into the adjacent library, where Carmen was dusting the extensive collection of rare books. The doctor's scientific mind demanded explanations for phenomena that appeared to contradict established medical understanding, and his inability to identify the catalyst for Isabella's improvement was clearly troubling him. Carmen finished her cleaning duties and requested a private meeting with Marcus through his personal assistant. Such requests from household staff were highly unusual, but the circumstances of Isabella's recovery had created an atmosphere where normal protocols seemed less important than finding answers to the medical mystery that had transformed their lives overnight. Marcus received Carmen in his study that evening, his expression mixing curiosity with the impatience that had become his default response to staff interactions. The day's miraculous events had left him emotionally drained, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from despair to hope that Isabella's awakening represented. He expected a brief conversation about household matters, perhaps a request for time off, or a minor administrative issue that required his approval. Carmen's opening words immediately captured his complete attention. She explained that she had information relevant to Isabella's recovery, information that might help Dr. Hayes understand the medical mystery that was puzzling the entire team. Marcus leaned forward in his leather chair, his businessman's instincts recognizing the significance of what he was about to hear even before Carmen revealed the details of her secret musical therapy. The revelation unfolded slowly, with Carmen carefully explaining her background in sacred music and her months of unauthorized visits to Isabella's bedside. She described her training in Gregorian chant, her understanding of how ancient musical traditions could affect human consciousness, and her growing conviction that Isabella's operatic background made her particularly receptive to therapeutic musical intervention. Marcus listened in stunned silence as Carmen detailed the gradual improvements she had observed and the dramatic breakthrough that had occurred the previous evening. The implications of Carmen's confession hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. For 3 years, he had exhausted his fortune and influence in pursuit of medical solutions that had proven ineffective, while the answer to Isabella's condition had been working in his own household. A domestic worker whom he had barely acknowledged had succeeded where teams of internationally renowned specialists had failed, using nothing more than her voice and her understanding of sacred musical traditions. The initial reaction was anger, a surge of fury at the deception that had been practiced under his own roof. Carmen had violated every protocol established for Isabella's care, conducting unauthorized treatments that could have endangered her recovery or interfered with legitimate medical interventions. The breach of trust seemed monumental, a betrayal of the confidence he had placed in his household staff to maintain the sterile environment that Isabella's condition required. But the anger quickly gave way to confusion and, ultimately, to a grudging admiration for the courage Carmen had shown in pursuing her unconventional therapy. She had risked her employment and potentially her immigration status to provide care that she believed could help Isabella, motivated not by personal gain but by genuine compassion for a suffering family. The results spoke for themselves in ways that transcended any concerns about proper procedures or medical protocols. Marcus demanded to know everything about Carmen's background, her training, and her reasons for concealing her qualifications. The conversation stretched deep into the evening as Carmen revealed the full scope of her previous life as Sister Carmen Elena Rodriguez, her years of specialization in sacred vocal arts, and the circumstances that had forced her to abandon her religious vocation in favor of domestic work that could support her family's medical needs. The transformation in Marcus's perception of Carmen was complete and irreversible. The woman he had dismissed as an anonymous member of his household staff was revealed to be a highly educated specialist whose expertise in therapeutic music exceeded that of most medical professionals. Her decision to work as a domestic worker represented not a lack of qualifications, but a sacrifice of professional status in service of family obligations that commanded his respect. Dr. Hayes's reaction to the revelation was initially skeptical, then fascinated as the medical implications became clear. Carmen's description of Isabella's responses to specific musical pieces provided crucial data for understanding the neurological mechanisms that had facilitated her recovery. The combination of familiar operatic melodies with the specific frequencies and modal structures of Gregorian chant had apparently created a unique form of auditory stimulation that could penetrate the barriers protecting Isabella's consciousness. The doctor requested detailed documentation of Carmen's musical therapy sessions, including the specific pieces she had performed and the timeline of Isabella's improvements. This information would be invaluable for developing formal protocols that could potentially help other patients in similar conditions. Carmen's informal experiments had inadvertently created original research in the emerging field of therapeutic music, contributing knowledge that could benefit countless families facing the devastation of persistent vegetative states. Isabella's own confirmation of Carmen's story came gradually as her ability to communicate improved. The removal of the ventilator apparatus allowed her to speak in whispers, and her first coherent words were expressions of gratitude for the music that had guided her back to consciousness. She described her experience during the coma as a state of profound isolation, aware of her surroundings but unable to respond, until Carmen's singing provided a pathway back to active engagement with the world. The reunion between Isabella and Carmen was deeply emotional, transcending the traditional boundaries between employer and employee. Isabella's recognition of the woman who had literally sung her back to life created a bond that redefined their relationship entirely. Carmen's months of secret vigils at Isabella's bedside had established a connection that went far beyond the professional obligations that had originally brought her into the Ashford household. Marcus faced the challenge of reconciling his treatment of Carmen with the magnitude of her contribution to his family's welfare. His dismissive attitude toward the household staff had blinded him to the extraordinary qualifications and compassionate nature of a woman who had been working in his home for over a year. The contrast between his assumptions about domestic workers and the reality of Carmen's background forced him to confront his own prejudices about education, social status, and the value of different forms of service. The practical implications of Carmen's revelation extended far beyond personal relationships. Marcus immediately consulted with his legal team about the liability issues surrounding unauthorized medical treatment, even treatment that had produced miraculous results. The lawyers advised caution in publicizing Carmen's role in Isabella's recovery, noting that irregularities in patient care could potentially create legal vulnerabilities despite the positive outcomes. But Marcus also recognized the injustice of allowing Carmen to continue in a position that failed to utilize her remarkable qualifications. Her expertise in therapeutic music represented a resource that could benefit not only Isabella's continued recovery, but potentially many other patients who might respond to similar interventions. The question became how to acknowledge her contributions while creating new opportunities that matched her actual capabilities. The solution emerged through discussions with Dr. Hayes and the broader medical team. Ashford Biomedical's research division had been exploring alternative therapeutic approaches for neurological conditions, and Carmen's success with Isabella provided compelling evidence for the potential of musical intervention in treating persistent vegetative states. A formal research position would allow her to develop and document her techniques while providing the scientific framework necessary to validate her methods. Carmen's initial response to the offer was hesitant, reflecting her awareness of how dramatically her life would change if she accepted a professional position that acknowledged her true qualifications. The safety of anonymity that domestic work had provided would be lost, potentially exposing her to attention that could complicate her immigration status or endanger family members who remained in politically volatile situations back home. Marcus addressed these concerns by offering comprehensive legal support and guarantees of privacy protection. The research position would be structured to minimize public exposure while providing Carmen with the resources and recognition she deserved for her contributions to Isabella's recovery. Immigration attorneys would ensure her legal status remained secure, and family support services would extend assistance to her relatives in Honduras as needed. The negotiation process revealed the depth of Marcus's transformation in his understanding of justice and appropriate compensation. The man who had once viewed household staff as interchangeable service providers now found himself crafting a comprehensive package of benefits and protections for a woman whose hidden talents had saved his wife's life. The contrast between his previous indifference and his current advocacy for Carmen's welfare illustrated the profound personal growth that Isabella's recovery had catalyzed. Dr. Hayes became an enthusiastic supporter of Carmen's transition to a research role, recognizing that her unique combination of musical expertise and practical experience with therapeutic intervention could advance medical understanding in unprecedented ways. Her informal experiments had already produced results that formal medical protocols had failed to achieve, suggesting that traditional approaches to consciousness recovery might benefit from incorporation of ancient wisdom about the healing power of music. The establishment of the Sacred Music Therapy Research Institute within Ashford Biomedical represented Marcus's commitment to legitimizing and expanding Carmen's work. The institute would provide her with a laboratory equipped for both musical performance and medical monitoring, allowing precise documentation of how specific musical interventions affected neurological function in various types of patients. Graduate students in both musicology and neuroscience would work under her direction, creating an interdisciplinary approach to therapeutic music that honored both scientific rigor and artistic tradition. Isabella's recovery continued to progress as Carmen developed more sophisticated musical therapy protocols, specifically designed to address the physical and cognitive challenges of extended coma recovery. The combination of Gregorian chant techniques with familiar operatic repertoire proved particularly effective in stimulating memory function and emotional responsiveness, suggesting that personalized musical therapy could be tailored to individual patients based on their cultural background and artistic preferences. The financial arrangements that Marcus established for Carmen reflected not only her professional qualifications, but also his recognition of the debt he owed for Isabella's life. The Research Institute directorship came with a salary commensurate with her expertise and responsibilities, supplemented by housing arrangements that allowed her to maintain her privacy while providing access to the resources necessary for her continued work with Isabella and other patients. Carmen's acceptance of the position marked the end of her career as a domestic worker and the beginning of a new chapter that combined her religious calling with cutting-edge medical research. The Sacred Music Therapy Research Institute would become her monastery, a place where ancient wisdom about the healing power of sacred sound could be studied and refined using modern scientific methods. Her work would honor both her religious training and her commitment to serving others through her unique gifts. The transformation of the Ashford household reflected the broader changes that Isabella's recovery had initiated. The sterile atmosphere that had characterized the estate during her coma was replaced by a warmth that acknowledged the essential humanity of everyone who contributed to the family's welfare. Marcus instituted regular staff meetings where household employees were treated as valued team members rather than invisible service providers, and compensation packages were reviewed to ensure fair treatment for all workers. Isabella's gradual return to vocal performance became a cornerstone of Carmen's research, documenting how musical expression could accelerate recovery from neurological trauma. The woman who had been silent for 3 years began working with Carmen to rebuild her voice, using the same sacred music techniques that had facilitated her awakening to restore the instrument that had defined her professional identity. Their collaboration created a unique case study in the relationship between consciousness, musical expression, and personal identity. The public announcement of Isabella's recovery was carefully managed to protect Carmen's privacy while acknowledging the role of innovative therapeutic approaches in facilitating the miracle. Medical journals expressed interest in documenting the case study, and other families dealing with similar conditions began seeking information about musical therapy options. Carmen found herself at the center of a growing movement to integrate traditional healing practices with modern medical science. The Sacred Music Therapy Research Institute attracted attention from medical schools and music conservatories around the world, creating partnerships that expanded the scope of research into therapeutic musical intervention. Carmen's work became the foundation for a new field of study that recognized the scientific validity of ancient wisdom about the healing power of sacred sound. Her journey from domestic worker to internationally recognized researcher illustrated the potential for hidden talents to emerge when circumstances allow individuals to fulfill their true calling. Marcus's relationship with Carmen evolved from employer and employee to professional colleagues united by their shared commitment to Isabella's continued recovery and the advancement of therapeutic music research. The mutual respect that developed between them transcended social and economic boundaries, creating a partnership based on complementary expertise rather than hierarchical authority. Their collaboration demonstrated how meaningful relationships could develop when people were valued for their contributions rather than their social status. Isabella's complete recovery remained a long-term goal, but the progress she had achieved under Carmen's care exceeded every medical prediction about her potential for improvement. Her ability to communicate had returned almost completely, her physical strength was gradually improving through targeted therapy, and her emotional connection to Marcus and the world around her grew stronger each day. The woman who had been lost to consciousness for 3 years was reclaiming her place in a world that had continued without her. The evening concerts that Carmen conducted for Isabella in the newly equipped music therapy laboratory represented the culmination of months of research and refinement in therapeutic musical technique. These sessions combined the ancient traditions of Gregorian chant with modern understanding of neurological function, creating interventions that addressed both the spiritual and physical aspects of healing. The music that had once echoed through medieval monasteries now served as medicine for conditions that contemporary science was only beginning to understand. Carmen's transformation from Sister Carmen Elena Rodriguez to domestic worker to Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, Director of Sacred Music Therapy Research, illustrated the complex pathways that individuals sometimes navigate in pursuit of their calling. Her willingness to sacrifice professional recognition in service of family obligations had ultimately led her to a position where she could serve humanity on a much broader scale, helping other families find hope in the face of seemingly hopeless medical conditions. The legacy of Isabella's awakening extended far beyond the Ashford family to encompass a new understanding of how ancient wisdom could inform modern healing practices. Carmen's work represented a bridge between worlds that had been artificially separated by the specialization of contemporary medicine, reuniting the scientific and spiritual approaches to human suffering that had once been integrated in traditional healing practices. The first patient to benefit from Carmen's formally established therapeutic music program arrived at the Sacred Music Therapy Research Institute 6 months after Isabella's recovery. Maria Santos was a 42-year-old teacher from Phoenix who had been in a persistent vegetative state for 8 months following complications during routine surgery. Her family had exhausted their savings pursuing experimental treatments, and Carmen's research represented their final hope for reaching a daughter, wife, and mother who seemed lost beyond the boundaries of medical intervention. Carmen approached Maria's case with the systematic methodology that had evolved from her work with Isabella, but she understood that each patient would require individualized musical therapy based on their cultural background, personal history, and neurological condition. Maria's Mexican heritage suggested that sacred music from the Latin American tradition might prove more effective than the European Gregorian chant that had facilitated Isabella's awakening, requiring Carmen to expand her repertoire to include indigenous musical elements that could resonate with different cultural experiences of the divine. The research laboratory that Marcus had commissioned for the Institute represented the perfect fusion of acoustic design and medical monitoring technology. Sound engineers had created an environment where musical vibrations could be precisely controlled and measured, while neurological equipment provided real-time feedback about patient responses to specific frequencies and modal structures. Carmen could now document the exact mechanisms through which sacred music affected brain function, providing the scientific evidence necessary to validate therapeutic approaches that had previously been dismissed as unproven alternative medicine. Dr. Elena Marchetti, the neurologist who joined the Institute from Stanford Medical Center, brought expertise in consciousness research that complemented Carmen's musical background. Together, they developed protocols for measuring the relationship between auditory stimulation and neurological recovery, creating the first formal academic framework for studying how ancient sacred music traditions could be applied to modern medical challenges. Their collaboration represented the kind of interdisciplinary approach that Carmen had envisioned when she accepted Marcus's offer to direct the research program. The success with Maria Santos came after 3 weeks of carefully calibrated musical therapy sessions that incorporated elements of traditional Mexican sacred music alongside the Gregorian chant techniques that had proven effective with Isabella. Carmen's approach involved gradual introduction of familiar melodies from Maria's childhood, hymns that her family reported she had sung in church choirs throughout her adolescence and young adulthood. The breakthrough occurred during a performance of Ave Maria sung in Spanish, the same prayer that had comforted generations of Latin American families in times of crisis and healing. Maria's awakening followed a pattern similar to Isabella's experience, but with variations that provided valuable data about how cultural background influenced the effectiveness of musical therapy. Her initial response was to the rhythmic elements of the sacred music rather than the melodic structures, suggesting that patients from different musical traditions might benefit from therapy protocols that emphasize specific aspects of sound and vibration. This discovery led Carmen to develop culturally sensitive approaches that honored the diverse ways that different communities had traditionally used music for healing purposes. The documentation of Maria's recovery provided the Institute with its first peer-reviewed publication in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, establishing academic credibility for therapeutic music research and attracting attention from medical schools worldwide. Carmen found herself invited to speak at conferences where she presented her work to audiences of neurologists, musicologists, and medical researchers who were beginning to recognize the potential for integrating ancient wisdom with contemporary scientific understanding. Isabella's continued improvement served as both inspiration and case study for the Institute's expanding research program. Her return to limited vocal performance 6 months after her awakening provided unprecedented documentation of how musical expression could facilitate neurological recovery, with brain scans showing continued improvement in regions associated with memory, emotional processing, and motor function. The woman who had been declared permanently disabled was gradually reclaiming abilities that medical science had pronounced irretrievably lost. The relationship between Isabella and Carmen had evolved beyond patient and therapist to become a genuine friendship based on shared appreciation for the transformative power of sacred music. Isabella's first-hand experience of consciousness recovery provided Carmen with insights that no amount of medical training could have supplied, while Carmen's ongoing musical therapy sessions continued to support Isabella's healing process. Their collaboration represented a unique partnership between someone who had experienced the journey back from unconsciousness and someone who understood the musical pathways that made such journeys possible. Marcus's transformation from skeptical businessman to passionate advocate for therapeutic music research surprised everyone who had known him during the dark years of Isabella's coma. His financial support for the Institute was unlimited, but more importantly, his personal involvement in the research program demonstrated a commitment that went far beyond mere philanthropy. He attended medical conferences with Carmen, learned to read neurological data, and became articulate spokesperson for the integration of traditional healing practices with modern medical technology. The Institute's third patient presented challenges that tested the limits of Carmen's developing expertise. Robert Chen was a 17-year-old violinist who had been in a coma for 4 months following a traumatic brain injury sustained in a car accident. His musical background suggested that instrumental rather than vocal music might prove most effective, requiring Carmen to expand her therapeutic approach to include instrumental sacred music traditions from various cultures. The case pushed her to collaborate with musicians specializing in instruments used in traditional healing practices, from Tibetan singing bowls to Native American flutes. The success with Robert came through a combination of Chinese traditional music and European sacred compositions, reflecting his dual cultural heritage and his training in classical violin. Carmen's therapy sessions incorporated elements of both traditions, creating musical bridges that honored different aspects of his identity while providing the neurological stimulation necessary to facilitate consciousness recovery. His awakening after 6 weeks of treatment provided additional evidence that personalized musical therapy could be effective across diverse patient populations. The growing reputation of the Sacred Music Therapy Research Institute attracted families from around the world, creating both opportunities and challenges for Carmen's expanding research program. Each new patient contributed to the developing understanding of how consciousness recovery could be facilitated through carefully designed musical interventions. But the emotional toll of working with grieving families required Carmen to draw upon the spiritual resources that her religious training had provided. The work demanded not only technical expertise, but also the compassionate presence that had sustained her through years of monastic service. Carmen's integration of prayer and meditation into her research methodology reflected her understanding that healing involved spiritual, as well as physical dimensions that traditional medical science often overlooked. The Institute's treatment protocols included contemplative practices that created healing environments where both patients and families could find peace amidst the uncertainty of consciousness recovery. This holistic approach acknowledged that therapeutic music worked not only on neurological function but also on the deeper levels of human experience where healing ultimately occurred. The international recognition that Carmen received for her pioneering work in therapeutic music research represented vindication for her decision to leave the security of domestic employment in favor of pursuing her true calling. Invitations to establish similar institutes in other countries provided opportunities to expand the research, while training other practitioners in the techniques she had developed. The woman who had once hidden her qualifications to secure employment now found herself at the forefront of a movement that was transforming medical understanding of consciousness and recovery. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.